Hello everyone! Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. Today we're going to focus on colonization, specifically the colonization of Latin America. Last class we talked about how Eastern Asian nations such as China and Japan locked their doors on European exploration, except for, of course, the Dutch. Because of this, European nations had to turn their attention towards the New World in regards to exploration and expansion. We're focusing on Latin America today because areas such as modern-day United States and Canada is going to be something you talk more about in your American history classes. So, let's get started. When we introduced the idea of exploration, we already mentioned Christopher Columbus a bit. We know he was looking for a sea route to Asia that didn't require going around the tip of Africa. Remember, no educated person at this time actually believes the world is flat. Christopher Columbus's theory was that the world was small enough you could sail west from Europe to Asia and not run out of the supplies needed for survival. As we talked about in our intro to exploration, Columbus ended up around here in the Caribbean and came into contact with Taino natives. Of course, since he thought he was in Indonesia, he called them Indians, which is where that incorrect term comes from. Christopher Columbus wrote a letter to the king and queen, really convinced that he was in the East Indies. He even said he originally thought he was on mainland China until he realized he sailed upon islands and then figured it must be Indonesia. In Columbus's letter, he tells the Spanish royals that if they give him the supplies needed, he would in return give them so many valuable resources from this new land he claimed for Spain. So the Spanish decided to fund 3 more journeys for Columbus. On these journeys, Columbus had the goal of finding natural resources such as gold, and even enslaved the Taino to do this. This had severe consequences, including the death of many Taino Native Americans. Death came for many reasons, and one of the largest factors was diseases such as smallpox. Fun fact, the Europeans and the Native Americans, specifically the Taino tribe whom Columbus interacted with, had different immune systems. And what I mean by that is the 2 groups of people came into contact with different germs growing up on opposite ends of the world. This meant they were susceptible and immune to different things. When the Europeans and the Native Americans came into contact with each other, they passed along germs that the other's immune system was not prepared to handle, and both sides got very sick. Here's the difference. When the Europeans passed their germs to the natives, it was able to spread throughout the entire tribe, the tribes they came into contact with, and so on and so forth. Some of these diseases were deadly and some were not, but both sorts were able to spread. The germs the natives gave to the Europeans, again, just like with the natives, some were deadly and some were not, but the deadly diseases were not able to spread throughout Europe. This was because those who got very ill would have died before getting back to their homeland to pass the disease on to anybody. Less severe diseases such as syphilis did spread throughout Europe from the New World. It's not that the Europeans passed germs and the natives didn't, it's that unfortunately for the Native Americans, deadly germs were in a better condition to spread among them than the Europeans. We already knew that the Europeans were interested in creating their own footholds in Asia. But once that door was shut in their face, it started the trendy idea of coming to the New World and claiming land for the sake of colonies. Now, with this idea of colonizing the New World came other new concepts that I would like to go over so you can see how they fit into our content moving forward. First, we have the Columbian Exchange, which seems like a big, complicated thing, but it's not. The Columbian Exchange is the idea that when the New World and the Old World came into contact, they exchanged resources and goods native to their land. For example, take the diseases we just talked about a second ago. The idea is that when the Native Americans and the Europeans came into contact with each other, they passed new diseases to each other, such as smallpox and influenza from the Europeans to the natives, and diseases such as syphilis to the Europeans. A not-so-deadly example of the Columbian Exchange would be fruits and vegetables that naturally grow in different areas. For instance, pumpkins and pineapples and avocados are native to the Americas. Europeans had never seen them before, so they were taking these foods home for the first time. Grapes, onions, and coffee beans are native to the Old World, so Native Americans were experiencing these foods for the first time. The same goes for animals and plants, but I think you get the gist of it by now. The Columbian Exchange is just the idea that when the Old World and the New World met, they exchanged natural resources. Some good, like food, some bad, like diseases. Another idea that's going to develop is this new idea of mercantilism. Again, it sounds really complicated, but it can be very simple. The idea of mercantilism is that a nation's power comes from their wealth. Simple enough, we've seen that all throughout world history. But to gain all of this wealth, a nation should 1. Obtain as much gold and silver as possible, and 2. Establish a favorable balance of trade. What I mean by a favorable balance of trade is that a nation should always export more than they import. Or in even simpler terms, a country should always sell more goods than they buy. These foreign places, such as Asia in the New World, have all of these fancy natural resources that Europeans want, but they don't want to have to buy them because remember, you want to sell more than you buy. So ideally, under mercantilism, if you control an area that produces these natural resources, you not only don't have to buy them, you can sell them. Let me try to give you a real-world example. If I own a garden that grows tomatoes, I do not have to buy tomatoes, and in fact, I can sell my tomatoes. That will make me money. But I also desire apples. My garden does not grow apples, but my neighbor's does. But I don't want to spend money on apples, so I'm going to get myself an apple tree so that I not only do not have to buy apples, I can now compete with my neighbor and sell these apples. Now I'm selling 2 different items, tomatoes and apples. Both are making me money and I don't have to buy either of them. In mercantilism, equivalent the idea of me getting my own apple tree as European monarchs claiming new lands that grow these natural resources. Does that help? With the concept of mercantilism, the idea is that colonies exist only to benefit the mother country. That's their whole job, is to make the mother country money. 2 other concepts we'll see grow are joint stock companies and capitalism. Joint stock companies worked kind of like modern-day corporations, with investors buying shares of stock in a company. It involved numerous people combining their wealth for a common purpose, and that common purpose at this time is colonizing America. Joint stock companies involved numerous investors, so individual members only paid a fraction of the total colonization cost. If the colony failed, investors only lost their small share. If the colony thrived, the investors shared the profits. After monarchs and their explorers claimed land for a nation, joint stock companies and monarchs would colonize the land, and this was made possible under capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership and the investment of resources. The idea of capitalism was that merchants could create their own wealth without the government. Capitalism is something we're going to focus on a little bit later in our course, but it grew during this time period and made concepts like joint stock companies possible. The Portuguese arrived on the shores of the Americas after Columbus, one of which was a man named Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci was Italian, just like Columbus, but he was hired by the Portuguese as Columbus was for Spain. It was Amerigo Vespucci who said, "You know what? I don't think this is Asia. I think this is a new world." And a few years later, a German map maker named this area America after him. Thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas that we learned about a while ago, Portugal already had land designated as theirs. In this area, the Portuguese built massive sugar plantations. The Portuguese kept pushing west, settling more land for their plantations, and today we call this land Brazil. Once again, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas, this was as far as the Portuguese were allowed to go, because the rest was supposed to be left for Spanish conquest. We already mentioned Ferdinand Magellan in our intro to exploration. He went to the Philippines. What we didn't mention was that he got to the Philippines by going around South America. His crew was the first to circle the world. Their trip was not a fun one. As supplies ran out, many on the journey did not survive, including Magellan, who was killed in the Philippines. He wasn't necessarily a big colonizer or conqueror for Spain. That title would go to the conquistadors. The most well-known conquistador was Hernando Cortés, who found himself on the shores of modern-day Mexico. Cortés and his conquistadors are the Europeans who came into contact with Native American empires such as the Aztecs. Cortés was fascinated with the gold-infested empire, and Cortés desperately wanted to control this area. He was very easily able to overthrow the Aztecs for three main reasons. First of all, the Europeans have guns, and the Native Americans don't. Never take a spear to a gunfight. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. You also have diseases spreading, like the ones we talked about earlier. But the most interesting reason the conquistadors were so successful, and a perspective you really don't hear often, is that Cortés had a lot of help from other Native Americans. You see, the Aztecs themselves were conquerors. They took over many Native American tribes and forced what they considered inferior people to pay a tribute to them, kind of like China. The Aztecs are ruling over thousands of people who hate them. Other Native Americans see Aztec practices such as human sacrifice as barbaric, and they want the Aztecs to fall. So many Native Americans help Cortés overthrow them. Now, did Cortés still murder and rape and pillage? Yeah, of course. That's what conquerors do. Same thing the Aztec leaders did to the native tribes they conquered. So did Genghis Khan, so did Augustus and Alexander. All conquerors do the same thing, no matter what part of the world they're from. Again, we don't learn about them because of their kind and shining personality. We learn about them because of how they impact the world. Another Spanish conquistador was Francisco Pizarro, who, like Cortés, took over a Native American empire, the Inca. Now, the Inca, like the Aztecs, were conquerors themselves. They ruled over thousands of people they conquered, forcing them to learn their language, practice their customs, and even forced every male peasant to participate in unpaid labor for the Incan government every single year. We typically have this idea that Native Americans were one giant united group of people who lived together peacefully until the Europeans came, and that's not the case at all. Every area of the world experienced conquerors and conquering. Now, being conquered is never a positive experience, and there certainly are terrible things that happen to the victims of conquerors. But again, there isn't an area of the world that was not responsible for conquering other neighboring people or nations. Pizarro was able to kidnap the Inca emperor, Atahualpa. Atahualpa said that if the conquistadors returned him, he would fill rooms of gold and silver for the explorers. The conquistadors accepted the ransom, but then they strangled the emperor anyways. Soon after numerous more examples like these, the Spanish established an American empire. Do you remember when we introduced exploration, we mentioned the Reconquista, basically the Crusades 2.0 kind of situation? Well, during the Reconquista, the Spanish lived among the Muslims as they conquered them and imposed Spanish culture on them. This was exactly how the Spanish treated the Native Americans in the area. The Spanish lived amongst them, meaning there was a mixing of people over time, and people who were a mixed race of European and Native American were called mestizos, and this is the beginning of where modern-day Mexican culture comes from. As more diverse populations came to the land, more titles were created. For example, when African slaves were brought to the area, those who were a mix of European and African were called mulatto. There actually is a chart to show the different names that were given to different kinds of people, and a type of caste system or ranking system was created that determined some of these races were considered better than the others, which is terrible. Interesting enough, though, is that this caste system was modified from an earlier Inca tradition where they rated people's worth based off of the kind of family they were born into. Something the Spanish did create was this almost kind of like a feudal system called the encomienda system. The Spanish king would grant land in the New World to encomendaros, and the king would tell these encomendaros, hey, you have a right to all of the goods produced on this land. So the encomendaros would use the Native Americans as labor on this land, and in return, the Native Americans were supposed to receive two things: Christianity, specifically Catholicism because Spain is a Catholic nation even after the Reformation, and protection. So on paper, this looked a lot like a feudal system, but in reality, the encomendaros did not hold up their end of the bargain as they should have. Many encomendaros were very brutal towards the Native Americans under their control, and many natives died under this system. In reality, the encomienda system was a way to get free labor, aka, slavery, and to convert more people to Catholicism, going back to our 3 Gs. The Native Americans as a whole did not just think, oh well, this is our lives now, and go with it. As with any example of conquering, there's going to be resistance. Resistance could be as simple as natives secretly rejecting Catholicism and practicing their own religion anyways, or as outward and bold as a full-on rebellion. One example of these rebellions would be the Pueblo Revolt, also called Pope's Rebellion, where after generations of the Spanish trying to force natives to abandon their religion and convert to Catholicism, the Native Americans in the area, led by a man named Pope, rose up and fought back, killing Spanish priests, burning down churches, and even driving the Spanish out of the surrounding area. It would actually take a while for the Spanish to regain control of that land. Even before this rebellion that specifically targeted Catholicism, there were many Spanish priests who spoke out against the treatment of Native Americans. One prominent figure who tried to help the Native Americans was a man by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. Priests such as de las Casas criticized the encomienda system and pushed for better treatment of the natives. He would even write in his book, "There is nothing more detestable or more cruel than the tyranny which the Spaniards used toward the Indians for the getting of pearl." It would actually be de las Casas who would suggest to the Spanish, hey, Africa has an entire slave trade. Why not just buy people who are already slaves instead of forcing these random people to become slaves? And that suggestion alone, of which Bartolomé de las Casas will later regret, opens up an entire new can of worms, one which needs its own day entirely. Next class, we're going to talk about why the slave trade became so popular in Africa anyways, and the kind of impact it'll have on the world when Europeans enslave millions for cheap labor in the New World. So, I'll see you then.